When Senator JD Vance demanded that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett remove herself mid-hearing, he expected compliance. What he got was something far sharper controlled. Surgical takedown broadcasts live across the country. The chamber was full, but few were truly paying attention. These hearings usually blurred together scripted remarks, half-hearted outrage, and the usual party line performance. This one had already dragged on for nearly 3 hours. Phones buzzed under the table. Senators delivered sound bites more than substance. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here for theatrics. She sat straight backed, her binder meticulously tabbed, her questions clear and grounded. Unlike most in the room, she wasn't performing. She was prepared. And she didn't need volume to command attention. Across from her, Senator Vance had said nothing to her directly all morning. But now, her pointed questions, specifically those about a set of private security contracts tied to one of his former donors, had drawn his attention. He didn't lash out right away. His frustration showed first in the way his pen tapped harder, the way his gaze narrowed. Crockett wasn't being combative. She was being precise, and that made it sting more. As I was saying, Jasmine continued, flipping a page. While we've seen some transparency improvements in HUD, we still haven't received full disclosure regarding the security contracts issued between March and June. That's enough, Vance cut in, his voice abrupt. Jasmine glanced up. I'm sorry. You're out of order, he said, leaning forward into the mic. This line of questioning exceeds your allotted time and violates subsection. He paused, pretending to reference a rulebook he hadn't touched all day. Section B, Clause 2. I'm going to ask that you remove yourself from this hearing. A. Ripple moved through the chamber. Staffers glanced at one another. Several looked down to see if that clause even existed. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply stared at him, letting the silence stretch. Not frozen deliberate, Senator. She said finally, slow and composed. You're asking me to leave. Because I asked about contracts that were due to be made public 6 months ago. I'm enforcing procedure, he snapped, louder this time, trying to assert control. You are in violation of Senate rules. Cameras blinked red. The chairwoman hesitated. Viewers watching at home weren't sure what they were seeing. Another partisan spat, maybe. But something in Jasmine's stillness made it clear. This was different. Her aide, Curtis, slid a sticky note toward her. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She'd been waiting for this kind of moment since her first committee assignment, being interrupted, underestimated, labeled too blunt, too loud, too black. And she had learned how to wait. Vance had just lit the match. But Jasmine wasn't going to explode. She was going to burn steady. She said nothing for 46 full seconds. In that stretch of silence, someone's pen stopped scribbling. A reporter whispered to a colleague. The live stream's chat started pinging. What just happened? She turned to a section of her binder, took a quiet breath, and smiled, not for theatrics. But because she already knew how this would go, she was about to flip the narrative, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been told to be smaller in a room like this. The air in the chamber shifted. It wasn't professional tension anymore, it was personal. Senator Vance didn't say another word. He didn't repeat his demand. Didn't look at her. Just leaned back, arms folded, hoping maybe she'd storm out, lose her temper, make a mistake he could later weaponize. But Crockett wasn't playing that game. Instead, she let the silence breathe again. 40-6 seconds may not sound like much, but in politics, that's an eternity. Long enough for the press gallery to start typing. One journalist tweeted, Jasmine Crockett challenges decorum without saying a word. Finally, she adjusted her microphone gently. Senator, she said, calm, collected. Every syllable a scalpel. I'm surprised you'd invoke Clause 2. It hasn't been used in over a decade, and even then, only once during an open hearing, and only after a member directly slandered a witness. She flipped to the clause and tapped it lightly with her finger, which, of course, I haven't done. Nor have I strayed from the scope of my questioning. She looked him straight in the eye. If this is about discomfort, she said, her voice level, that's not grounds for removal. Somewhere in the back, someone let out a quiet laugh. It's a kind that escapes when a room's tension finally breaks. Jasmine Crockett wasn't going anywhere. Vance forced a smile, tight and hollow. Congresswoman, this committee has rules. I'm speaking on public record, Jasmine replied, still polite, still composed, but unmistakably firm. If the senator has any documentation showing, my inquiry is out of bounds, she continued, sliding her binder forward. I'll gladly yield. Would you like to cite it? Silence. Vance didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the chairwoman, seeking backup. But she didn't come. To his rescue? Not this time. She leaned in slightly, caught between protocol and uncertainty, clearly unwilling to defend a claim without evidence. And that's when Jasmine moved in, not with her body, but with her words. She leaned just a little closer to the mic, lowered. Her voice, is that the transparency you campaigned on, Senator? She asked, soft, controlled. A question spoken so quietly, the room had to lean in to hear it. And just like that, the silence broke. Not loudly, but sharply. Like a dropped binder in a quiet library. It didn't shout. It accused. C-SPAN caught. It cleaned. So did every reporter in the room. Within seconds, the clip was already being cut, captioned, and shared. One sentence, perfectly timed, crafted not for drama, but for impact. It's a kind of moment that doesn't just survive the hearing, it outlives it. Vance blinked, opened his mouth, closed it again. Jasmine didn't smirk. She didn't look triumphant. She just turned a page in her binder.com and unshaken, as if the hearing hadn't just shifted on its axis. Technically, it continued. Other voices returned. Other questions filled the air. But the mood had changed. Jasmine hadn't just defended. Her place she'd reminded everyone why she had one. Outside the chamber, the world was already reacting. And it was moving faster than anyone inside could see. By the time the next senator started speaking, Jasmine had withdrawn not physically, but mentally. Her posture didn't change. Hands rested calmly on the binder. Up, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, back in a different room, 3 years earlier. Her first year in Congress, a subcommittee on federal prison reform. Back then, she was new, still figuring out when to speak, when to wait. She had raised concerns about discrepancies in inmate health contracts, brought the evidence, had the receipts. But a senior member cut her off with a laugh, dismissing her concerns as misplaced passion. You're more activist than legislator, he'd said. The room laughed, some out of discomfort. Some didn't bother to hide it. She hadn't known the rules well enough to push back. Not then. She packed her notes, walked out, pretended to have another meeting. In reality, she returned to her office and began reading. Every rule, every clause, every case where people like her had been shut down by obscure procedures and outdated decorum. She stayed up past 2 a.m. reading, watching, learning, highlighting. The moments, especially the ones where Black women had been silenced, not by argument, but by technicality. It became less about anger and more about survival. She knew it would happen again, so she prepared. And now, here she was. In the next time, JD Vance didn't know what she'd carried into this room. He thought this was a scene, a performance. But Jasmine Crockett didn't perform. She documented. She remembered. She glanced at a tab in her binder labeled 2021 Hearing Committee Challenge, yellow with 2 creases from repeated use. That forgotten case, buried in a procedural transcript, had stuck with her. A committee member silenced using the same clause Vance had just invoked. The ruling was overturned within the hour. The chair had cited the essential role of inquiry and oversight, especially when public funds were involved. Jasmine had memorized every word. Not for ambition. For defense. Her aide, Curtis, knew that look on her face. It wasn't pride, it was precision. Check Twitter, she murmured without moving her lips. Curtis opened the app. It's trending, he whispered. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't react, not yet. Oh. But she exhaled, slow, measured. She picked up her pen, wrote a brief note in the margin, and circled the time, 2:41 p.m. That was the moment everything shifted. Not when she spoke, not when she asked the question, but when she didn't flinch. She scanned the room. Most faces had returned to their default expressions, blank, unreadable, but not all. A junior senator from Oregon shot her a quick glance. It could have been respect, maybe recognition. Didn't matter. She wasn't here to be acknowledged. Still, something in JD Vance's posture had changed. He wasn't slouched back anymore, sat upright, still but alert. The smugness that had curved his mouth earlier was gone. Now he stared at the table in front of him. Not at any document, just at space, waiting, processing, like someone realizing the ground had just shifted beneath the man, unsure how deep the fracture went, and it would run deep. Not because of this one exchange, but because of what it revealed. For too long, men like him had underestimated women like her. They mistook restraint for weakness, composure for surrender. But Jasmine Crockett had learned that real power didn't come from outshouting anyone. It came from building a case so airtight that the opposition walked right into it, and then had nowhere left to go. Still, she knew the quiet wouldn't last. Outside that hearing room, the moment was already catching fire. Just after 3 p.m., the clip hit X, a 46-second video. One question, one silence, no yelling, no fireworks, just intent. A local NBC affiliate had lifted the footage directly from the C-SPAN stream. No edits, no dramatic music, no commentary, just her voice. Is that the transparency you campaigned on, Senator? The views hit 40,000 within the first hour, then 200,000, then 500,000. Like a spark dropped in dry grass. It didn't just spread, ignited. Curtis leaned over, showing her the numbers on his screen. She glanced, blinked once. Let it breathe, she said, closing her binder slowly. Don't repost it. Don't quote it. Don't say anything. You want us to just ... let it sit? Curtis asked. She nodded. Let the country talk first. Inside the chamber, the hearing limped forward. A senator from Wyoming droned on about procurement fraud. Another brought up state audit concerns. But the air had thinned. The focus was gone. People were physically present, but mentally elsewhere. In Toledo, a civics teacher paused class to replay the clip and explain it. In Sacramento, a barista rewatched it 3 times during her break. In Tampa, a newsroom producer pitched a new headline. Black Congresswoman holds her ground without raising her voice. This wasn't just viral. It had weight. Meanwhile, Vance remained in his seat, arms folded, papers untouched. He kept his eyes, low jaw locked tight. His silence wasn't neutral, it was cornered. The tension in his posture gave him away. This wasn't how he'd imagined the clip going. He'd tried to quiet her, push her out cleanly. But she'd handed his own move right back to him without even raising her voice. Worse, she had used precedent, a ruling he likely hadn't read. There was no spin strong enough to blur those optics not when millions were already watching, unfiltered. Eventually, the chairwoman called it early adjournment. It was a quiet admission of defeat. The hearing had been slated to run 2 more hours. But everyone knew the story had already left the room. As Jasmine gathered her papers, a few reporters tried to intercept her. She shook them off politely. Tomorrow, she said. I'll talk tomorrow. Curtis followed her out. His phone buzzed constantly inside his jacket. We're getting calls, he told her. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. You're on the front page of 3 digital outlets already. She stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the parking level. I didn't say anything wild, Curtis, she said evenly. He nodded. Exactly. That's why it's hitting. She didn't smile, she just looked tired. But beneath that, razor sharp. Focused, because she understood something most people didn't. Attention wasn't the win. It never was. Moments. Like this. They passed. Headlines faded, hashtags cooled. What mattered was what you did with the moment after it landed in your lap. As the elevator door slid open, her phone vibrated again. She checked the name. Senator Arlene Boone. It had been a long time. 40 years in the Senate, known for never offering praise, not even in private. The message had been brief, but it was enough. It meant something. Jasmine didn't reply. She slid into the back seat of the car, kicked off her heels, and finally let herself exhale. Not a full breath, but enough to loosen the tension in her shoulders. Because this time, she hadn't just endured the moment, she had owned it. Still, silence doesn't last long after a moment goes viral. And not everyone was impressed. JD Vance sat alone in his office, wearing the same suit from the hearing. His tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The overhead fluorescent lights washed him out in a way cameras never captured, but people always noticed. He hadn't said a word since returning. K2 aides hovered by the door, pretending to scroll their phones, waiting for the temperature to drop. But this wasn't a silence of calculation. It was one of frustration. Pull the footage, Vance muttered. We've got it, one aide said. 6 versions, different angles. Already everywhere, X, TikTok. Some even have captions. He? Winced captions. Theed nodded. One says, when the teacher knows the rules better than the principal. The screen lit up. The clip rolled. Jasmine Crockett leaned in, calm and measured. Is that the transparency you campaigned on, Senator? No music, no flair. Just clarity. A voice that didn't waver. A delivery too sharp to be spontaneous. It felt real. Vance's eyes narrowed. She set that up. Had to. You don't drop that line unless you knew it was coming. Brent, his communications director, cleared his throat. We flagged her prep last month. She's been going through committee tapes. Even the obscure ones. She's thorough. She ambushed me. Vance snapped. On live TV, made me look like a bully. Brent was careful. Sir, with respect, you interrupted her. Mid-sentence. Vance glared at him. She knew the rule book better than we did. He said after a pause. That's dangerous. Brent didn't argue. Across the Capitol, Jasmine sat in her office, barefoot, sipping lukewarm coffee. She wasn't watching the numbers climb. She already knew. Curtis walked in, holding a legal pad. 3 interview requests. The Root wants a profile. Boston Globe wants to shadow you next week. She raised an eyebrow. They didn't care last year when I introduced the audit transparency bill. They care now. She looked down. Tapping her pen on the notepad, not giving them sound bites. This isn't about a sentence. Curtis hesitated. Kind of is, though. That line landed clean, quiet. That's why it hit. And that's why they'll try to twist it, she said. Say it was scripted. Say I played it for the camera. He asked gently. Was it? She gave him a half smile. Wouldn't matter. What matters is I meant it. Curtis nodded and handed her a printed transcript of the hearing, formatted, time-stamped, in case you want to post it before someone edits it wrong. She flipped through the pages, stopping at the moment that had shifted the entire day to 41 p.m. Still there, still hers. Her phone buzzed. Not a journalist, not a network. Shelby Warner, conservative, moderate, Kansas. She never got involved. At a bipartisan dinner once, she'd told Jasmine, I stay out of the fights. Safer that way. But now her message read, what you did today wasn't just smart. It was surgical. Thank you for holding your ground. Jasmine stared at it. This wasn't about party lines. Wasn't about loyalty. It was recognition from someone who saw truth hold its own. Not through volume, but through clarity. Because today hadn't just silenced a room. It exposed who had done their homework. Still, not everyone saw it that way. Others were already scheming how to reclaim the narrative. By evening, her office door barely stayed closed. Calls poured in. Not just from media or donors, from nurses in Tulsa, a retired professor in Santa, a college junior in Des Moines who said she'd never watched a hearing before but for the first time. She felt seen. Curtis managed the chaos. Kept the door shut. Jasmine remained at her desk, steady, focused. She didn't need trending hashtags to tell her what had happened, because when you speak with substance, you don't need to shout. Down the hall, a few colleagues drifted by during the hour. Quiet nods. A couple of whispered thank yous. Nothing public. Nothing official. But Jasmine noticed. Even the ones who usually acted like she wasn't speaking, they were watching now. Meanwhile, JD Vance's office stayed dark. No press statement, no tweet. Just one dry sentence from a staffer making rounds online. The senator stands by his interpretation of procedural rules. It didn't slow the storm. Commentators from every corner of the political map had already weighed in. A former White House communications director tweeted, "Crockett handed Vance a live civics lesson and he failed the quiz." Another, "Cleanest takedown on the Hill this year." And it wasn't just the press. By 6 p.m., one of the biggest education YouTubers, a woman known for explaining legal events to high schoolers, posted a video titled, "What Jasmine Crockett Just Taught Us About Power." It hit 800,000 views before midnight. Curtis reappeared, tablet in hand. "You're in every major news cycle. NPR ran it." Even the Daily Caller reposted the clip. Jasmine glanced up, snarky. He nodded. Their caption reads, "Congresswoman Crocker silences JD Vance with law school lecture voice." She gave a small, amused smile. "That's all they've got. They can't challenge the facts, so they're mocking my tone." She leaned back. "Let them. You don't win by sounding aggressive. You win by being undeniable." And that was the key. She hadn't humiliated him. That would have looked petty. She'd simply outmaneuvered him. In public, with a binder, a steady tone, and a memory too sharp to dismiss. She hadn't aimed for applause, but she'd earned respect. Still, Curtis looked uneasy. "What?" she asked, catching his face. He hesitated. "There's pushback brewing." From the press, from his team. She waited. "Looks like they've started digging. Opposition research. Trying to spin this like it was all staged. Like you baited him." Jasmine let out a slow breath. "So they're nervous." Curtis nodded. "They're calling it intentional optics manipulation, because I read the rule book. They're saying you were tipped off, that we orchestrated it for the cameras." She raised an eyebrow. "Are they wrong?" Curtis grinned. "Not completely." She leaned forward. "Let them talk. Let them scream setup. They're not mad that it worked. They're mad I didn't flinch." Footsteps echoed outside. Her office, a few reporters loitered near the elevators. She didn't look up. Her eyes weren't on today. They were on what came next. Because this wasn't just about going viral. This was about credibility. About making it harder for the next person to pull the same trick on the next woman. Who sat in that seat? She pulled a notepad toward her and started scribbling headlines. Not reactive sound bites. Real issues. Proactive, buried beneath scandal and noise. "Curtis," she said. "Start lining up local press. I want public radio, regional outlets, school papers." He blinked. School papers. Especially school papers. The ones who watched that clip today, they're voting in 6 years. But while she stayed focused, not everyone had moved on. The flashbacks were creeping back in. The first time Jasmine Crockett ever spoke at a public hearing. Her voice shook not from fear, but adrenaline. The kind that hits when your body knows something your mind hasn't admitted yet, that you're being watched, judged, measured. It was in Baton Rouge, a courthouse. Basement, standing room only. Hot air creeping through the vents. She was just a state rep. The topic: a botched utility contract. But she'd found something. A shady broker deal buried in the fine print. She stood up and named names. One city councilman rolled his eyes and muttered into the mic, "That's cute." It stung, not because it surprised her, but because it worked. The room chuckled. She looked young. She looked alone, but she didn't stop. That night, she didn't sleep. She replayed every second, every word, trying to figure out what she'd done wrong. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't lost her cool, so why had her presence been so easy to dismiss? The answer didn't come all at once. It took a year of watching how others moved, especially white men. How they could raise their voices and be called passionate. How women had to pad their arguments with soft language just to avoid sounding aggressive. So Jasmine started experimenting. She slowed her cadence, lowered her pitch, practiced in courtrooms using a raised eyebrow instead of a raised hand. Not to perform, but to stay in control. Precise words mattered. But so did delivery. By the time she arrived in D.C., she was fluent in 2 languages. The language of truth, the language of power. Still, there were missteps. In her first month, in Congress, she introduced a transparency bill. Infrastructure contracts, cleanly written, budget-backed. Endorsed by 2 major think tanks, and yet before she reached her second point, a senator cut her off. "I think you're conflating local and federal jurisdiction, Congresswoman." She wasn't, not even close. But the room nodded with him anyway. That was the game. You didn't have to be right. Confident. Because confusion was a weapon, especially when the person across from you was already underestimated. That night, she scribbled a note in her journal. Be unshakable. Be undeniable. Let them bury themselves. It wasn't a mantra. It was a strategy. Survival code. And now, sitting in her office, legs curled under the chair, hair down. She flipped to that same notebook dot on the next page. Her grandmother's words. They'll stop swinging when they hit steel. And that's what happened today. Vance had swung, expecting the usual, a raised voice, a rant, a scene he could twist into chaos. Instead, heat steel. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't bend, doesn't break. The kind that forces a man to see what he doesn't want to face. Jasmine rose and walked to the window. The Capitol dome stood glowing in the dusk, beautiful at a distance. Almost romantic. But she knew better. The system wasn't noble. It was messy, corrupt, manipulated. Still, she fought for it, not because it was perfect, but because people deserved better than those who treated democracy like theater behind her. Curtis was silently clipping footage for the morning press briefing. He didn't speak. Just sorted, time-stamped, organized. She let him work. She needed this moment because the noise wouldn't last. The spotlight would move. And the next battle was already on the horizon. But for this one breath, she let herself feel something. Rare pride. Not the loud kind, not the viral kind. The quiet kind, the kind that settles deep when you know you stood your ground. Not for claps, not for a headline, but for the ones watching. The ones who've been ignored their entire lives. Yet even as she stood in that calm, elsewhere, chaos was waking up. At JD Vance's office, the damage control had begun by 5 a.m. His chief of staff, Lorna DeWitt, was already at her desk. Coffee untouched. Hair still wet from a rushed shower. What had started as an awkward clip was now a full-blown crisis. And narratives, once they take hold, don't let go easily. They expected some backlash. A few snide headlines. What they didn't expect was bipartisan applause. The worst part, no one had edited anything. No dramatic music. No misleading voiceovers, just raw, steady footage. Jasmine, dismantling his argument with calm, clinical precision. It was undeniable. And that made it impossible to fight. So what do we have? Lorna asked. Pacing. Brent, the comms director, looked exhausted. We tried the angle that she staged at that her aide prepped a script and didn't land. Just made her look more prepared. Like she knew her stuff. People respected it. Lorna frowned. What about the violated decorum line? Backfired. Legal scholars on both sides said she was within her rights. She sighed, frustrated. She slammed her pen down. Silence, no one spoke. Because they all knew they weren't dealing with a meltdown. They were dealing with a message. One that had already landed. That afternoon, Vance agreed to a brief sit-down with a conservative-leaning podcast based in Arizona's safe territory. Familiar host, the kind of space where narratives could be gently redirected. The strategy was simple. Frame the incident as a minor misunderstanding, a procedural misstep, not a confrontation. It didn't work. The host opened with a softball. Were you just trying to maintain order during a chaotic hearing? Vance nodded. Of course. There are rules, and we're just trying to uphold those. Congresswoman Crockett has a reputation for speaking forcefully. I tried to redirect, but the host gently pressed again. Right, but she referenced a 2021 precedent that directly contradicts your objection, didn't she? Vance tried a smile. I haven't reviewed that transcript fully. My team is looking into it. That one line blew up. Vance admits he didn't know the rule. Senator's failed attempt to silence Crockett spirals into embarrassment. My team is looking into it, the non-apology echoing through the Hill. Even conservative columnists started siding with Crockett. One Arizona Sentinel piece read, "You don't have to agree with her politics to admit she played the moment, right? That's what accountability looks like." Meanwhile, Jasmine said nothing. Her office released a short statement reaffirming her commitment to transparency, facts, and open dialogue in committee hearings. No hashtags, no shade, no spin. That silence drove Vance's team crazy. Because when you're the only one making noise, every sound gets amplified. Then came the leak. An anonymous source inside Vance's office released an internal email chain not explosive, but telling. It revealed that one of Vance's senior advisors had warned him before the hearing, Crockett may cite the 2021 clause decision. Don't challenge her unless you're sure. He ignored it, and the media ran with it. Vance was warned, challenged anyway. Staff cautioned Senator before clash with Crockett. Back in Jasmine's office, Curtis stood in the doorway. Phone in hand. Want to read it? She didn't look up from her laptop. I already know what it says. He hesitated, then added, even politicos saying you might have just shifted the power dynamic on oversight. She allowed herself the smallest smile. That's not what I was trying to do, I know, Curtis replied, which is probably why it worked. She nodded, mostly to herself. For years, she'd watched men stumble through talking points and still get the benefit of the doubt. Watch them bend rules and call it strategy. But the one time she kept her composure, they panicked, scrambling to frame it as some premeditated performance. Let them. She wasn't there for theater. She was there for policy, for truth, for the people who lived with the consequences of every decision made in that building, but were never invited to testify. And while the headlines churned, something quieter was happening. Something harder to spin. A shift. It started in a hallway. Late at night, after a session, Jasmine was heading toward the elevators when Senator Eleanor Hatch 72 from Vermont stopped her. Hatch, a moderate with a reputation for sharp memory and soft politics, placed a hand on Jasmine's arm. You know, that thing you did? We tried for years to make silence speak louder than anger. She paused. Most of us gave up. Jasmine blinked. You think I was silent? Think? You were measured, and that scares them more than anything else. Then Hatch walked away. No cameras, no speech. Just one veteran passing on something that felt like a torch. The next morning, Jasmine came into her office early, before staff, before the press, needing the quiet, not for planning or reflection. The moment had already passed. Clips had gone viral, meme edits, TikTok's music overlays. podcast dissections, but the moment was never the point. What came after was, because now, a few Republicans, not the loud ones, but the ones who did the work, had started stopping her. And the hallway, asking about bill language, asking to understand her logic. Nothing on the record. No headlines, but it meant something. They weren't writing her off anymore. Even if they disagreed, they were paying attention. They'd seen something rare in that building. A lawmaker hold power without needing to feed it. Someone who disarmed ego with facts and didn't apologize for being right back in Texas. The district office was flooded. Not emails. Not tweets, letters, handwritten, from teachers. Bus drivers. Retired veterans. Curtis had to call in extra help just to sort through the stacks. One letter stood out. It was from Lorraine Shields, 78 years old. Marfa, Texas. She wrote, "My late husband always told me, ever raise your voice to be heard. Just speak the truth and let it echo." That afternoon, Vance agreed to a short interview with a conservative podcast based in Arizona. Friendly ground, a sympathetic host. The plan was to reframe the controversy as a misunderstanding. A technical misstep rather than an attempt to silence. It didn't go as planned. The host tossed him an easy question. "Were you just trying to maintain order in a chaotic hearing?" Vance nodded. "Of course. There are rules. We're simply trying to keep things on track, Congresswoman. Crockett is known for being forceful. I was trying to redirect." But the host pressed. "She quoted a 2021 precedent that contradicts your objection, right?" His smile tightened. "I haven't fully reviewed that transcript. My team is looking into it." That one line detonated. Vance admits he didn't know the rule. Senator fumbles. Crockett challenge blames the clock. The non-apology heard round the hill. Even conservative pundits began to shift. A columnist in the Arizona Sentinel wrote, "You don't need to agree with her politics to admit she played it right. That's what accountability looks like." Jasmine didn't respond publicly. Her office released a single sentence, reaffirming her commitment to transparency and facts. No digs, no spin, just steady. That silence drove Vance's team mad. Then came the leak. An anonymous source from inside his office released internal emails. They weren't explosive, but they were clear. A senior advisor had warned him days before the hearing not to challenge Crockett without verifying precedent. He'd ignored the advice. Jasmine's team wasn't behind it. They were just as surprised. But the story broke wide open. Vance ignored staff warnings before confronting Crockett. In Jasmine's office, Curtis stood in the doorway, phone in hand. "Wanna read it?" She didn't even look up from her laptop. "I already know what it says." He lingered, then added, "Even Politico says you may have just shifted the balance on oversight." She smiled, just barely. "That wasn't the goal, I know," Curtis said. "It's probably why it worked." She nodded, half to herself. For years, she'd watched men misspeak and still get the benefit of the doubt. She'd seen colleagues twist rules into strategy. But the moment she stayed composed under pressure, they called it a trap. Let them. She wasn't in this for theater. She was here for policy, for integrity. For the people whose names would never appear on C-SPAN, but lived with the consequences of those votes, and something was shifting. Started with a quiet moment in the hallway. Senator Eleanor Hatch of Vermont, 72, a moderate with a mind like a vault, stopped her near the elevator. "You know," Hatch said, placing a hand gently on Jasmine's arm, "we tried for years to make silence speak louder than anger. Most of us gave up." Jasmine blinked. "You think I was silent? I think you were measured, and that scares them more." Then she walked away. No cameras, no follow-up, just a torch, passed. The next morning, Jasmine arrived early. No press, no staff. She needed quiet, not to strategize, just to breathe. The moment had passed, turned into memes, podcast debates, remixes. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was this. Some of the quieter Republicans, not the Camera chasers, but the workhorses started stopping her in the hallway. Not to argue, to ask about language in her bills, to understand her logic. Nothing public, but something had changed. They didn't dismiss her anymore. Even if they didn't agree, they'd seen her do something rare. Hold power without performing. It disarmed ego with facts. Stay right without demanding credit. Back home, her district office was overwhelmed. Real mail. Teachers, bus drivers, retirees. Curtis brought in extra hands just to sort the letters. One stood out. From Lorraine Shields, Marfa. Texas. 78 years old, widowed. My late husband always told me, ever raise your voice in a room full of men who doubt you. Make them strain to hear you, and they'll listen harder. That's what you did, Miss Crockett. I just wanted to say thank you. Jasmine kept that one in her bag. Meanwhile, Vance's office was unraveling. The leak triggered an internal investigation. One staffer quit. Another went on leave. The press wouldn't drop it. The issue wasn't just that he got it wrong, was that he tried to downplay it. Then pass the blame, and people noticed. Jasmine still didn't comment. But behind closed doors, her team was already preparing the next move. Curtis brought it up during the weekly committee review. We should reintroduce the transparency package. Same one from last year. She looked at the binder dog-geared. Coffee-stained tabs everywhere. It's the same binder from the hearing. Not flashy, but solid. The bill was still intact. Stronger now? Maybe. Because now people believed she could carry it. Curtis leaned in. We could loop and hatch, maybe even warn her. If we move fast, she cut him off with a wave. No press release. Not yet.
Ow.
It's real. They'll come. That evening, she walked the hallway outside the chamber alone. Portraits of men lined the walls, men who never had to raise their voices, but for all the wrong reasons. Now, her name was in those rooms not as a disruptor, but as someone who held her ground and didn't flinch. And the ones who dismissed her, they weren't just watching, they were listening. But before anything could move forward, there was one last call. It came just after 9:30 p.m. Unknown number. Washington area code. She almost ignored it. Crockett. A pause. Then a voice she recognized. Congresswoman JD Vance. She didn't answer, just leaned back in her chair. I wanted to speak directly, he said. No press, no staff, just... I didn't expect that moment to unfold the way it did. Still, she stayed silent. Not out of spite, out of principle. I was wrong, he continued. Not just about the procedure. I underestimated how prepared you were. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. You tried to pull the mic away, she said. Just didn't let go. He chuckled softly, not with humor, more with resignation. Fair enough. I didn't expect you to stay calm. That part, she said, was the point. Silence again. Not strategic, just human. Then he said something she didn't expect. Years ago, I used to go with my mom to town halls. She got talked over every time. Eventually, she just stopped going. Said no one really wanted to hear what women had to say unless they were quiet enough to ignore. Jasmine waited. She would have liked what you did. It didn't excuse anything, but for a moment, it made him human again. Well, she said, you can still choose to listen now. If you reintroduce that bill, he said, I might actually read it this time. She smiled. Just slightly. Read the whole thing, Senator. Not just the parts that comfort you. The call ended soon after. No promises, no alliances. But something shifted. Not politically, personally. Not all bridges need to burn. Some just need to be seen from both sides. The next morning, Jasmine stood outside the Capitol speaking into a mic for a local station. No national press, no spectacle. Just one reporter, asking about oversight reform. She explained the bill. She explained why it mattered. It's not a word about Vance. Not a word about the moment that went viral. 'Cause if you really win, you don't need to keep reminding people. The story tells itself. Later that day, she passed a group of interns near the reflecting pool. One looked up young, maybe 20, whispered something. Another smiled shyly. Studying government? She asked. One nodded. Trying to? It's harder than it looks. She glanced at their notebooks, their hopeful eyes. The weight of future's still unshaped. You don't have to speak loud, she said. Just make sure when you do, they can't ignore you. That moment, small, off-camera, meant more than any headline. Because the real story wasn't about a comeback or a takedown. It's preparation. Preparation, knowing your worth when others try to erase it. Speaking when it matters, okay? And letting silence do its work when it doesn't. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a political exchange. She showed the country, and especially the women watching, that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Then strikes precisely, calmly, and leaves no room for denial. If you're still here, the story meant something to you. Subscribe if you believe facts still matter. If you believe calm still wins. And that the best moments in politics don't need to be loud, just true.